Hello, everybody. We are back. I feel like I keep saying that every time. With To Kill a Mockingbird, and we are starting with chapter 16, which is on page 208. When last we left, we started to find out more and more about how all the varieties of people in the town felt about Atticus and him taking on this case of Tom Robinson. There were several gentlemen who were worried about it, and also some who were very angry and meant to do Tom Robinson harm, and maybe even Atticus if he got in the way. And Scout unwittingly stopped them from doing anything bad, but as she stepped in to the group and started talking to Mr. Cunningham and making connections with him. So it's summer. Dill is there. When we started the book, Scout said that she and Jem often talked about what caused Jem's arm to be broken. And it was broken pretty badly. And badly enough that it still has a little bit of a deformity to it. We are fast approaching the time when he broke his arm. Was it Boo Radley? Was it the Ewells? It's very hard to tell. But let us forge forward and see what happens as we get into that moment. Jem heard me. He thrust his head around the connecting door. As he came to my bed, Atticus's light flashed on. We stayed where we were until it went off. And we heard him turn over, and we waited until he was still again. Jem took me to his room, and he put me in bed beside him. Try to go to sleep, he said. It'll all be over after tomorrow, maybe. We'd come in quietly, so as not to awake Auntie. Atticus killed the engine in the driveway and coasted to the car house. We went in the back door and to our rooms without a word. I was very tired, and was drifting into sleep when the memory of Atticus calmly folding the newspaper and pushing back his hat became Atticus standing in the middle of an empty waiting street, pushing up his glasses. And the full meaning of the night's event hit me, and I began to cry. Jem was awfully nice about it. For once he didn't remind me that people nearly 9 years old didn't do things like that. Everybody's appetite was delicate that morning, except for Jem's. He ate his way through 3 eggs. Atticus watched in frank admiration. Aunt Alexandra sipped coffee and radiated waves of disapproval. Children who slipped out at night were a disgrace to the family. Atticus said he was right glad his disgraces had come along, but Auntie said, nonsense, Mr. Underwood was there all the time. You know, it's a funny thing about Braxton, said Atticus. He despises Negroes, won't have one near him. Local opinion held Mr. Underwood to be an intense, profane little man, whose father, in a fey fit of humor, christened Braxton Bragg, a name Mr. Underwood had done his best to live down. Atticus said naming people after Confederate generals made slow, steady drinkers. Calpurnia was serving Aunt Alexandra more coffee, and she shook her head at what I thought was a pleading, winning look. You're still too little, she said. I'll tell you when you ain't. Well, I said it ain't. It might help my stomach. All right, she said, and got a cup from the sideboard. She poured 1 tablespoon of coffee into it and filled the cup to the brim with milk. I thanked her by sticking out my tongue at it and looked up to catch Auntie's warning frown. But she was frowning at Atticus. She waited until Calpurnia was in the kitchen, and then she said, Don't talk like that in front of them. Talk like what in front of whom? He said. Like that in front of Calpurnia. You said Braxton Underwood despises Negroes right in front of her. Well, I'm sure Cal knows it. Everybody make 'em knows it. I was beginning to notice a subtle change in my father these days, what came out when he talked with Aunt Alexandra. It was a quiet digging in, never outright irritation, and there was a faint starchiness in his voice when he said, Anything fit to say at a table is fit to say in front of Calpurnia. She knows what she means to this family. But I don't think it's a good habit, Atticus. It encourages them. You know how they talk amongst themselves. Everything that happens in this town's out in the quarters before sundown. My father put down his knife. I don't know of any law that says they can't talk. Maybe if we didn't give 'em so much to talk about, they'd be quiet. Now why don't you just drink your coffee, Scout? I was playing in it with a spoon. I thought Mr. Cunningham was a friend of ours. You told me a long time ago he was. He still is. But last night he wanted to hurt you. Atticus placed his fork beside his knife and pushed his plate aside. Mr. Cunningham's basically a good man, he said. He just has his blind spots along with the rest of us. Jem spoke. I don't call that a blind spot. He'd have killed you last night when he first went there. Yeah, he might have hurt me a little, Atticus conceded. But, son, you'll understand folks a lot better when you're older. A mob's always made up of people, no matter what. Mr. Cunningham was part of a mob last night, but he was still a man. Every mob in every little southern town is always made up of people, you know. Doesn't say much for 'em, does it? Well, I'll say not, said Jem. So, it took an 8-year-old child to bring 'em to their senses, didn't it? Said Atticus. That proves something, that a gang of wild animals can be stopped, simply because they're still human. Maybe we need a police force of children. You children last night made Walter Cunningham stand in my shoes for a minute, and that was enough. Well, I hoped Jem would understand folks a little better when he was older. I wouldn't. First day Walter comes back to school will be his last, I affirmed. You will not touch him, Atticus said flatly. I don't want either of you bearing a grudge about this thing, no matter what happens. You see, don't you, said Aunt Alexandra, what comes of things like this. Now don't say I haven't told you. Atticus said he'd never say that, pushed out his chair, and got up. There's a day ahead, so excuse me, Jem. I don't want you and Scout downtown today, please. As Atticus departed, Dill came bounding down the hall into the dining room. Well, it's all over town this morning, he announced. All about how we held off 100 folks with our bare hands. Aunt Alexandra stared him to silence. It was not 100 folks, she said, and nobody held off anybody. It was just a nest of those Cunninghams, drunk and disorderly. Oh, Auntie, that's just Dill's way, said Jem, and he signaled us to follow him. You all stay in the yard today, she said, as we made our way to the front porch. It was like Saturday. People from the south end of the county passed our house in a leisurely but steady stream. Mr. Dolphus Raymond lurched by on his thoroughbred. Don't see how he stays in the saddle, murmured Jem. How can you stand to get drunk for 8 in the morning? A wagon load of ladies rattled past us. They wore cotton sunbonnets, and dresses and with long sleeves. A bearded man in a wool hat drove them. Yonder, some Mennonites, Jem said to Dill. They don't have buttons, and they live deep in the woods. Did most of their trading across the river, rarely came to make 'em. And Dill was interested. They've all got blue eyes, Jem explained, and the men can't shave after they marry. Their wives like for 'em to tickle 'em with their beards. Mr. X. Billups rode up on a mule and waved to us. He's a funny man, said Jem. X is his name, not his initial. He was in court one time and they asked him his name, and he said X. Billups. Clerk asked him to spell it, and he said X. Asked him again, and he said X. Well, they kept it up till he wrote X on a paper and held it up for everyone to see. They asked him where he got his name, and he said that's the way his folks signed him up when he was born. As the county went by us, Jem gave Dill the histories of general attitudes of the most prominent figures. Mr. Tensall Jones voted the straight prohibition ticket. Miss Emily Davis dipped snuff in the private. Mr. Byron Waller would play the violin. Mr. Jake Slade was cutting his third set of teeth. A wagon load of usually stern-faced citizens appeared. When they pointed to Miss Maudie Atkinson's yard ablaze with summer flowers, Miss Maudie herself came out on the porch. There was an odd thing about Miss Maudie on her porch. She was too far away for us to see her features clearly, but we could always catch her move by the way she stood. She was now standing arms akimbo, her shoulders drooping a little, her head cocked to one side, her glasses winking in the sun, and we know she wore a grin of the utmost wickedness. The driver of the wagon slowed down his mules, and a shrill-voiced woman called out, "He that cometh in vanity departeth in darkness." And Miss Maudie answered, "A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance." Well, I guess that the foot washer thought that the devil was quoting scripture for his own purposes as the driver was speeding his mules. Why they objected to Miss Maudie's yard was a mystery, heightened in my mind, because for someone who spent all the daylight hours outdoors, Miss Maudie's command of scriptures was formidable. "You going to court this morning?" asked Jem. He had strolled over. "I am not," she said. "I have no business with a court this morning." "Well, aren't you going down to watch?" asked Dill. "I am not. It's morbid, watching a poor devil on trial for his life. Look at all those folks. It's like a Roman carnival." "Well, they have to try him in public, Miss Maudie," I said. "Wouldn't be right if they didn't." "Well, I am aware of that," she said. "Just because it's public, I don't have to go, do I?" Miss Stephanie Crawford came by. She wore a hat and gloves. She said, "Look at all those folks. Well, you'd think William Jennings Bryan's was speaking." "And where are you going, Stephanie?" inquired Miss Maudie. "Oh, to the Jitney Jingle." Miss Maudie said she'd never seen Stephanie go to the Jitney Jungle in a hat in her life. "Well," said Miss Stephanie, "I thought I might just look in at the court, just to see what I was up to." "Better be careful he doesn't hand you a subpoena." We asked Miss Maudie to elucidate. She said Miss Stephanie seemed to know so much about the case she might be called on to testify. Well, we held off until noon, when Atticus came home to dinner and said they spent the morning picking the jury. After dinner, we stopped by Dill and went to town. It was a gala occasion. There was no room at the public hitching rail for another animal. Mules and wagons were parked under every available tree. The courthouse square was covered with picnic parties, sitting on newspapers, washing down biscuit and syrup with warm milk from fruit jars. Some people were gnawing on cold chicken and cold fried pork chops. The more affluent chased their food with drugstore Coca-Cola and bulb-shaped soda glasses. Glassy-faced children popped the whip through the crowd, and babies lunched at their mother's breast. In a far corner of the square, the Negroes sat quietly in the sun, dining on sardines, crackers, and the more vivid flavors of knee-high cola. And Mr. Dolphus Raymond sat with them. "Jim," said Dale, "he's drinking out of a sack." Mr. Dolphus Raymond seemed to be doing so. 2 yellow drugstore straws ran from his mouth to the depths of a brown paper bag. Ain't ever seen anybody do that," murmured Dale. "Well, how does he keep it? What's in it?" And Jim giggled. "Well, he's got a Coca-Cola bottle full of whiskey in there, and that's not so as not to upset the ladies. You'll see him sip it all afternoon. He'll step out for a while and fill it back up." "Well, why is he sitting with the colored folks?" "He always does. He likes 'em better than he likes us, I reckon. Lives by himself way down the county line. He's got a colored woman and all sorts of mixed chillin'. We'll show you some of 'em if we see 'em." "Well, he doesn't look like trash," said Dill. "He's not. He owns all one side of the river bank down there, and he's from a real old family to boot." "Well, then why does he do like that?" "That's just what he is," said Jim. "They say he never got over his wedding. He was supposed to marry one of the Spencer ladies, I think. Well, they were going to have a huge wedding, but they didn't, and after the rehearsal, the bride went upstairs and she blew her head off. Shotgun. She pulled the trigger with her toes." "Did they ever know why?" "No," said Jim. "Nobody ever knew quite why but Mr. Dolphus. They said it was because she found out about his colored woman. He reckoned he could keep her and get married too. He's been sort of drinking ever since. You know, though, He's a real good to those children. Jim, I asked, what's a mixed child? Half white, half colored. But you've seen him, Scout. You know that red, kinky-headed one that delivers for the drugstore? He's half white. They're real sad. Sad? How come? Well, they don't belong anywhere. Colored folks won't have 'em because, well, they're half white. And white folks won't have 'em because they're colored. And so they're just in between. They don't belong anywhere. Mr. Dolphus, now, they say he shipped 2 of his up north. They don't mind 'em up north. Yonder is one of 'em. A small boy clutching a Negro woman's hand walked toward us. He looked all Negro to me. He was a rich chocolate with flaring nostrils and beautiful teeth. Sometimes he would skip happily, and the Negro woman tugged his hand to make him stop. Jem waited until they passed. Well, that's one of the little ones, he said. How can you tell? Asked Dale. He looked black to me. You can't sometimes, just unless you know who they are. But he's half Raymond, all right. But how can you tell? I asked. I told you, Scout, you just have to know who they are. Well, how do you know that we ain't Negroes? Well, Uncle Jack Finch says we really don't know. He says as far as he can trace back the Finches we ain't, but for all he knows we might have come straight out of Ethiopia during the Old Testament. Well, if we came out during the Old Testament, it's too long ago to matter. That's what I thought, said Jim. But around here, once you have a drop of Negro blood, that makes you all black. Oh, hey, look! And some invisible signal had made the lunchers on the square rise and scatter bits of newspaper and cellophane, wrapping paper. Children came to the mothers, babies were cradled on hips as men in sweat-stained hats collected their families and herded them through the courthouse doors. In the far corner of the square, the Negroes and Mr. Dolphus Raymond stood up, dusted their breeches. Well, there were a few women and children among them, which seemed to dispel the holiday mood. They waited patiently at the doors behind the white families. Let's go in, said Dale. No, we better wait till they get in. Atticus might not like it if he sees us. The Macon County Courthouse was fairly reminiscent of Arlington in one respect. The concrete pillars supported its south roof were too heavy for their light burden, and the pillars were all that remained standing when the original courthouse burned in 1856. Another courthouse was built around them. It is better to say, built in spite of them. But for the south porch, the Macon County Courthouse was early Victorian, presenting an unoffensive vista when seen from the north. And from the other side, however, Greek revival columns clasped with a big 19th century clock tower housing a rusty, unreliable instrument, a view indicating a people determined to preserve every physical scrap of the past. To reach the courthouse on the second floor, one passed sundry sunless county cubbyholes. The tax assessor, the tax collector, the county clerk, the county solicitor, the circus clerk, the judge of probate lived in cool, dim hutches that smelled of decaying record books mingled with old damp cement and stale urine. It was necessary to turn on the lights in the daytime. There was always a film of dust on the rough floorboards, and the inhabitants of these offices were creatures of their environment, little gray-faced men, and they seemed untouched by wind or sun. We knew there was a crowd, but we had not bargained for the multitudes in the first-floor hallway. I got separated from Jem and Dale, but made my way toward the wall by stairwell, knowing Jem would come for me eventually. I found myself in the middle of the Idlers' Club and made myself as unobtrusive as possible. This was a group of white-shirted, khaki-trousered, suspended old men who spent their days doing nothing and passed their twilight days doing same on pine benches under the live oaks on the square. Attentive critics of courthouse business, Atticus said that they knew as much law as Chief Justice from long years of observation. Normally, they were the court's only spectators, and today they seemed resentful of their interruption of their comfortable routine. When they spoke, their voices sounded casually important, and the conversation was about my father. "I thinks he knows what he's doing," one said. "Oh, how? I wouldn't say that," said another. "Atticus is Finch's deep reader, a mighty deep reader." He reads all right, that's all he does, the club snickered. Let me tell you something now, Billy, a third said. You know the court appointed him to defend that man. Yeah, but Atticus aims to defend him. That's what I don't like about it. This was news that put a different light on things. Atticus had to, whether he wanted to or not. I thought it odd that he hadn't said anything to us about it. We could have used it many times in defending him and ourselves. He had to. That's why he was doing it. Equaled fewer fights and less fussing. But did that explain the town's attitude? The court appointed Atticus to defend him. Atticus aimed to defend him. That's why they didn't like about it. It was confusing. The Negroes, having waited by the white people to go upstairs, began to come in. Whoa, now, just a minute, said a club member, holding up his walking stick. Just don't start up them there stairs a while. The club began its stiff-jointed climb and ran into Dill and Jem on their way down looking for me. They squeezed past and Jem called, Scout, come on, there ain't a seat left. We'll have to stand. Look here now, he said irritably as the black people surged upstairs. The old man ahead of them would take most of the standing room. They were out of luck, and it was my fault, Jim informed me. We stood miserably by the wall. Can't you all get in? Reverend Sax was looking down at us, black hat in hand. Hey, Reverend, said Jim. Nah, Scout here messed us up. Well, let's just see what we can do about that. Reverend Sax edged his way upstairs. In a few moments he was back. There's not a seat downstairs. Do y'all reckon it'd be all right if you all came to the balcony with me? Gosh, yes, said Jim. Happily, he sped ahead of Raymond Sax to the courtroom floor. There, we went up a covered staircase and waited at the door. Reverend Sax, I don't know why I'm yawning so much. Reverend Sax came puffing behind us and stared us gently through the black people in the balcony. 4 Negroes rose and gave us front row seats. The colored balcony ran along 3 walls of the courthouse like a second-story veranda, and from it we could see everything. The jury sat to the left, under long windows. Sunburned, lanky, they seemed to be all farmers, but this was natural. Townfolk rarely sat on juries. They were either struck or excused. 1 or 2 of the jury looked vaguely like dressed-up Cunninghams. At this stage, they sat straight and alert. The circus solicitor and another man, Atticus and Tom Robinson, sat at tables, with their backs to us. There was a brown book and some yellow tablets on the solicitor's table. Atticus's was bare. Just inside the railing that divided the spectators from the court, the witness sat on cowhide-bottomed chairs, and their backs were to us. Judge Taylor was on the bench, looking like a sleepy old shark, his pilot fish rotting rapidly below in front of him. Judge Taylor looked like most judges I'd ever seen, amiable, white-haired, slightly ruddy-faced. He was a man who ran his court with an alarming informality. He sometimes propped his feet up. He often cleaned his fingernails with his pocket knife. In long equity hearings, especially after dinner, he gave the impression of dozing, an impression dispelled forever when a lawyer once deliberately pushed a pile of books to the floor in a desperate effort to wake him up. Without opening his eyes, Judge Taylor murmured, Mr. Whitley, do that again and it'll cost you $100. He was a man learned in law, and although he seemed to take his job casually, in reality he kept a firm grip on any proceedings that came before him. Only once was Judge Taylor ever seen at a dead standstill in open court, and the Cunninghams stopped him. Old Sarum, their stopping grounds, was populated by 2 families separated and apart in the beginning, but unfortunately bearing the same name. The Cunninghams married the Coninghams until the spelling of the names was academic until a Cunningham disputed a Coningham over land titles and took the law. During a controversy of his character, James Cunningham testified that his mother spelled it Cunningham on deeds and things, but she was really a Coming, Coningham. She was an uncertain speller, a seldom reader, and was given to looking far away sometimes when she sat in the front gallery in the evening. After 9 hours of listening to the eccentricities of old Salem's inhabitants, Judge Taylor threw the case out of court. When asked upon what grounds, Judge Taylor said, "Campertus conivis," and declared he hoped to God the litigants were satisfied by each having had their public say. Well, they were, and that was all they'd wanted in the first place. Judge Taylor had one interesting habit. He permitted smoking in his courtroom, but he did not himself indulge. Sometimes, if one was lucky, one had the privilege of watching him pull a long dry cigar into his mouth and munch it down slowly. Bit by bit, the dead cigar would disappear, to reappear some hours after as a flat, slick mess, its essence extracted and mingling with Judge Taylor's digestive juices. I once asked Atticus how Mrs. Taylor stood to kiss him, but Atticus said that they didn't kiss much. The witness stand was to the right of Judge Taylor, and when we got to our seats, Mr. Heck Tate was already on it. And that is the end. The trial begins. There's a lot of talk about mixed kids, mixed people, half white, half black. And Dill says, why does Dolphus Raymond hang around with black people? That's not right. That there's nothing, it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with him. And it is, I think that prejudice can come in a lot of ways. And I think that these kids, they obviously have no problem sitting up with Reverend Sax and with all of the colored people in the colored section. They understand that there's a certain pecking order of how things should go. White people are first in everything, whether it's going up the stairs or sitting somewhere or doing whatever. But, and that you don't marry someone who's black, you don't date someone who's black, there's a lot of lines that one doesn't cross. Remember that these are kids and they learn these rules from their adults. And Jem and Scout have a father who may know these rules, but I don't think he necessarily agrees with them. But he doesn't go out of his way to try and buck those. And do remember what they said Dolphus Raymond does to, be able to deal with all of this drama in his life and what he's drinking out of those paper bags. So the trial is beginning, and when we return to the reading or listening to me read, we will get into the thick of the trial. They don't expect that it's going to last very long. The chances of Tom Robinson being set free or found not guilty are very slim because he is a black man. We know that, and you should know that going in. The kids do not know that or think that. So the odds are already against him because he is black. And we're going to just see kind of what happens. Do not forget to take your quizzes this week. And if you're listening to this, thank you. And, get that app on your phone because you can be able to listen to all of these without having to only be plugged into your computer. So, while you're walking around the house and doing chores for your parents, vacuuming and doing dishes and all that kind of stuff, you could be listening to this and getting your homework done at the same time. All right, I will see you next week.